Hello, everyone. It's Charlene Lee, and I am broadcasting today from London, from our offices here at PA Consulting. And so I'm thrilled to be talking today about psychological safety. And I wanted to talk about this because it's a really hot topic these days, and a key part of being a disruptive leader. Because if you want to do huge, exponentially disruptive change and growth, then you're going to have to make it safe for people to go way out of their comfort zone and be able to make these changes happen. And the only way that's going to happen is if your teams, the people on your teams, and frankly, your entire organization feels psychologically safe, emotionally safe to be able to put forward these audacious ideas and know that they're not going to be held and listened to and held accountable for whether the ideas work or not, but at least be able to have a shot at being heard and listened to and accepted in terms of what they say. So today I'm going to talk about how we do this, and in particular, how do we scale it inside of an organization out of a small team. I'll be sharing some of the research that we've done at PA, some research that's been done by Amy Edmondson, a professor at Harvard Business School, and also from Google. And then we'll end up with some ideas of what you can do as a leader. So first of all, I would welcome you to share, how do you create psychological safety in your organization? And so please share, and would love to just hear what you're doing, what's working, maybe even talk about what's not working, things that you tried, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit about those things. So first of all, I want to go and talk a little bit about what is it that inspired me to talk about this. And some of you may know that I just recently came back from Burning Man, which is this, I don't know what you call it, this gathering of 80,000 people in the Nevada desert. And I spent 12 days out there helping set up my camp and stayed all the way to the very end. And one of the things that struck me is that there's no weird at Burning Man. There's no such thing as something so out of the ordinary that you don't go, well, that's kind of interesting. There's no judgment in particular. One of the key principles of Burning Man is radical self-expression. And I love this part of Burning Man because people feel so free. They're absolutely free to express all aspects of themselves. And some of it can be very, very different than what you would normally see in the real world, or as we call it, the default world. But out there in the middle of the Nevada desert, it all works. And what was interesting is that, again, there is this no such thing as that's too out of the ordinary because of this principle of self-expression. And what was interesting is this a realization when I was out there that there was no judgment. People feel capable of this radical self-expression because they felt that there wasn't going to be judgment around them. And that gave them tremendous freedom. And I was talking to somebody who was out there talking about how wonderful this is, what a difference it is. And one of the things that they shared with me was that it isn't necessarily just the absence of judgment, but it's also the presence of not acceptance, but of allowance. And they shared with me this really interesting quote, and I have a screenshot of it here. And I'm going to read it because it's a little hard to read. And one of the things that it says is, in judgment, one is bound to that which is judged, energetically and karmically. And allowance, now this is not acceptance, but it's allowance. We give way to freedom in our own experience and that of others, creating the opportunities needed for our growth and evolution. Allowance is not approval or agreement. It is freedom. And this was a really profound and something very interesting for me to hear about this, because when you think about what non-judgment is, it's not the absence of judgment, it's the presence also of allowance. And the difference between allowance and acceptance is really important. Because if I were to accept everything that was around me, that would require another level of agreement. And I may not necessarily agree with the ideas that are coming out or the self-expressions of everybody that's out there. That's great for you, maybe not for me though. And in the workplace, it's the allowance of new ideas. It's the allowance of alternative points of view. I can suspend judgment on that, but it also doesn't mean that I have to accept it. And I think this difference, the difference between acceptance and agreement with allowance, is the key thing that I think we're missing in our psychological safety ideas. And the reason why it becomes so difficult for us as organizations to truly allow psychologically safe spaces to exist. So I want to talk a little bit about what allowance means and also what psychological safety means. We'll come back to allowance in just a second. And I have a couple comments here from people. Let's see. So Sanjay, so B2, thank you so much. B2, thank you so much for saying that you love this topic. And Sanjay has a great question. Is this basically emotional safety? I think part of it is emotional safety, but because the definition of psychological safety that Amy Edmondson, again, a professor at Harvard Business School, developed back in 1999, so she's been at this for a very long time, over 2 decades now, it's the absence of interpersonal fear, meaning that I'm not fearful that something I say or do is going to be interpreted in the wrong way by somebody else in my team. And so there's the emotionality of the fear, but I think it's also the psychological impact that it has on not just my emotions, but also my psychological well-being. So there's a lot wrapped up into that. We'll dig into that a little bit also as well. And Priscilla also has this, like, what is psychological safety? Let's define that in more detail. So let me talk a little bit more about that in particular. So the way that Amy Edmondson talked about it is the absence of interpersonal fear, and instead it's replaced by a trust inside of a team and broader inside of an organization that allows people to experiment without judgment, to voice opinions without being shamed, to fail without being labeled a failure. Because the idea is that if you want your team to perform well, then you're going to have to make sure that people are coming up with new ideas, that they can challenge each other, that someone can say safely, things aren't working for me, I need help, and not be looked down upon. That is a level of psychological safety to be able to come forward and say, I am being vulnerable here at this moment. And you won't be vulnerable and admit that something is wrong or call out something that you see is wrong unless you feel really safe and confident. And so this is a really breakthrough idea back in 1999 that Amy put out to say, how do we create psychologically safe areas for our teams? And one of the things that is really important is that when you feel safe, you take on more responsibilities, you admit your mistakes, you talk about shortcomings, you learn new things. And so those are all important things to have to look at. So just a couple of things. One of the things we did at PA Consulting, we recently published a study that was done with the Ministry of Defense, and you can see the URL here. I put a short link into it. You go to bit.ly/psych-safety.mod, Ministry of Defense. Some work that we did with the Ministry of Defense here in the UK. And one of the things we wanted to look at was, when does psychological safety exist? And we surveyed over 250 leaders and asked them, what is the state of psychological safety that you feel as weighed against your well-being? And a couple of things, we definitely saw that psychological safety was linked to the well-being score. So 29% of the variance in well-being was allocated and attributed to psychological safety. And the top quartile of people, of performers, of the leaders who had high psychological safety also had a 47% higher median well-being score than the lowest quartile. So there's a strong correlation between psychological safety and overall well-being. And I think especially in this time after COVID, we're very keen on understanding the well-being of our teams, of our people. And psychological safety is one of the top indicators of whether that well-being is there or not. We also found a very interesting thing inside MOD, that small teams, this is a quote, small teams have psychological safety and trust, but poor organizational safety and trust dissolves and undermines it. So while there's psychological safety in small teams that an individual leader is able to create, that tends to evaporate when those interpersonal relationships start expanding to the larger organization. So this is where I think is a big gap, in that organizations can focus and individual leaders can focus on creating psychological safety with a direct leadership impact on their teams, so direct impact on their teams. But that tends to evaporate if psychological safety is not a priority for the larger organization, and that teams feel psychologically safe to connect, to talk to each other. Because of the gamesmanship, the politics, the one-upping, the fight for limited budgets and resources, there's a sense that we can hang together as a team and be psychologically safe. But we're not going to go and talk to another team and talk to them about really in a very honest, transparent, and vulnerable way about what's working, what's not, or even suggest things that could be different because we might be punished as a team. So this is just some interesting research that I think is really advancing some of the ways to think about it, because we've oftentimes think about psychological safety as something that we do inside of a team, that a leader has a direct impact on that team. But I also want to ask that if we are thinking about this at an organizational level, what are the things that we can do to really make a difference? So I just want to go back and see some of the comments from people. Lots of comments here. Okay, let's see what we have here. Okay, this is great. So Christopher from Google, fantastic. We have a voice from Google. Psychological safety is one of the most important foundations for a blameless culture of innovation. Christopher, so glad that you're joining us today. You can hold me to be accurate or not, because I'm going to share some of the research that Google had around what makes for effective teams. And absolutely, psychological safety is at the very top of the list. And I'll share some of the findings from that, and I'll share the report too as well. Tammy has this to share: safety of failure and not being put down in front of your colleagues. Behavior towards another person when things go right and when things go wrong, feeling balanced in these areas is really important. So thank you so much for sharing that, Tammy. It is balanced either way. So that's such an important thing, because this idea of how do we treat failure? I've talked about what is our relationship with failure as leaders, as individuals, and frankly, as an organization. When we see failure, do we start assigning blame? When we see failure, do we hold it against that person or that team? Or do we see failure as, wow, we took another step in the way, we're learning as we go along? So I'll talk about how we think about failure, especially as I talk about the Google thing. Let's see, we have here also from Sanjay, psychological safety plays an important role in developing safety culture in the organization. We as safety professionals, Sanjay, use this strategy to motivate employees so they can own the responsibility to practice while they work at risk. So Sanjay, it sounds like you are in a safety organization where safety is paramount. So in those places, it's incumbent on individuals. When they see something, they have to say something. And it's this imperative to say there's no bad raising of hands, because it's incumbent on every single person's responsibility. So we'll talk a little bit about the different levels and types of psychological safety. And then Gaurav says, the way I understand it, people in the team this is a definition of psychological safety. People in the team are not afraid of sharing a new idea, admitting a mistake, sharing a different opinion. They know they won't be embarrassed or punished for doing these things. And thank you, Gaurav, for that additional definition of what psychological safety is. I love how the participants in this live stream today are really building on these ideas, because psychological safety can mean so many things to different people. So I want to go on and talk a little bit about what this looks like. And in particular, I want to talk about a study that Google did. And this is something they did over 2 years. They worked with 3,000 teams, I believe. And one of the things they found out was, what are the elements that make a successful team? And there were 5 factors. And again, this is Google, who had that whole idea of fail fast, fail smart. Well, how do you actually do that? Because it's not, and one thing I learned about Google is that when things don't work out, they separate the failure of a project, of an initiative, separate that from the failure of an individual. the project failed, the individuals did not. And I see this repeated over and over and over again. Again, that's the aim. And the number one thing that they focused on was psychological safety. The question is, can we take risks on the team without feeling insecure or embarrassed? Other factors like dependability, structure and clarity, meaning of work, the impact of the work, all ladder down from having that psychological safety. So some of the things they started doing was actually measuring psychological safety, having pulses, having new norms, like having a moment at the beginning of every meeting where people talk about risks that they've taken. So we'll talk about some of those areas. But I think if you're interested in how one organization thinks about and uses psychological safety to increase the performance of teams, then Google case study is a really good example of that. And so one of the things that I do want to think about is also just what are the stages of psychological safety? Because I've worked with some organizations where it literally had the leaders in an organization get up at the front of the stage and go, our biggest problem here is that we don't take risks. And I want to assure you that it is safe to take risks. Go out there, make mistakes, fail fast, learn a lot, go out there and challenge the status quo. Lots of applause on the stage. And I turned to my stakeholder, my client, and I said, do you believe that? She goes, no, nothing's going to change. Because that's one person at the front of the room waving their hands and saying, go out there and we're going to change this culture. And the belief that it's just going to automatically change. Instead, there's building blocks that need to be laid. And some of the things that I've come across is that there are stages of psychological safety that take place not only in a team, but also in the organization. If those 4 stages are, first of all, inclusion. Each of these stages tap into some of the most basic needs that we have as humans. Again, to be psychologically safe, you need to pass through all of these stages to get to the point where you would actually be that challenger. In the first stage is, hey, just make me feel included. Do I feel like I belong? Am I part of this tribe? And it's a major reason why efforts around diversity, equity, and inclusion are so important. It's not just the D and E, the diversity and equity part. It's the inclusion part that becomes, that is the outcome, the sense that you feel like you belong. And when you belong, when you feel like you're seen and known as an individual, fully appreciated, and you're part of the tribe, that gives you a sense of safety inside of the tribe. But that's the first step, is making sure that people feel like they belong. The second stage is really about being able to learn. And as you all know, when you're learning, you make a lot of mistakes along the way. And you're going to be asking a lot of questions that may be very obvious to everyone, but you may not know. And so this is the ability to ask questions, to feel safe, that you feel like there are no dumb questions, that you can get feedback, that you can experiment and make mistakes. And there's no fear of looking dumb, because we're all learning here. So the first stage is inclusion. The second stage is that you can feed that need to grow, feed the need to be included, feed the need to grow and to learn. The third stage is when you are actively contributing. You're putting out new ideas, and this feeds the need to have an impact. We know that work is so much more fulfilling. Our well-being is good. Our team performance is good when every single person feels like they're making a contribution and having an impact. And so contribution stage of psychological safety is that you're given the freedom and the discretion to go out there and try and contribute in all the unique and different ways that you can. And this is where micromanaging is not a good thing, because micromanagers feel like you can't be trusted to know what is good or not. And instead, leaders who create that space, create that allowance for people to contribute, means that increases the confidence that people have and also the competence that people have and being able to develop themselves. The last stage is a challenger stage. And this is our need to make things better. We can look at the existing situation and we go, there's got to be a better way to do this. And that's when you can say, look, I know that this is the way we have acceptedly done things for a millennia, but maybe we should try things this way. And this is the highest stage of psychological safety because you are going up against potentially hundreds of years of the status quo. You're challenging the status quo. You're saying that maybe the way we do things isn't the best way. We can try something different. And that takes a tremendous level of psychological safety. You can imagine that being able to get to that point, you don't get to that point unless the other three stages of inclusion, of being a learner, a contributor, then you can become a challenger. And the reason why I wanted to go through that is that as leaders of organizations trying to create these audacious changes, these disruptive exponential changes, we need to think very strategically about where we are in that maturity model of psychological safety. Because if people just basically don't feel safe or even included, they're not going to be able to challenge. So if you want challengers, if you really welcome those really challenging points of view, then you're going to have to build that up. It's not something that you can just turn on the switch and overnight make sure and ensure that people feel psychologically safe to put out those big, audacious, really challenging points of view. So I'm just going to check and see if there's any comments here. So let's see. We have comments here from Sanjay again that psychological safety also helps the employees to express their feedback related to safety ideas, innovative solutions, critical issues, development initiatives. So it's a strategic tool to help employees and organizations together. It's a win-win scenario. Sanjay, this is a great example again that it's when you invest in psychological safety, it may feel like it's taking a lot of time from the things that you have to get done. But what we've seen over and over again in Amy Emerson's work really shows us is that when you increase psychological safety, team performance goes up. And there's a direct correlation between those two. So any investment in psychological safety is also going to raise the team performance. And Jay has this great comment. Yeah, this is basically Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So this is about safety, about adaptation, about achieving that higher level of attainment in our hierarchy of needs. So thank you for all of that. So just want to go on and just talk about some of the very concrete actions that you can take. I have 5 of them. The first one is a very personal one, and that is to be, as a leader, to develop the self-awareness of your own emotions and fears. Because if you want to be able to accept and include people who are really different from you, who are going to really challenge how you see the world, you have to understand the types of emotions and fears that they bring up. So this is the kind of work that we as leaders have to do to understand our biases, to understand where we get triggered, where things really bother us, and to be aware of that. And to be especially aware that when those emotions are coming up, to really remember at that point, I need to step back, remove judgment, create allowance, and know that I don't have to necessarily accept this idea. I don't have to agree with it to be able to listen to it. And that is something we have to train ourselves as leaders to do. Because if we can't do that first, most basic step to create that space within ourselves, to have that allowance, then we're never going to be able to create it for our teams. So the very first thing I encourage leaders to do is to work on themselves, to understand when these new and challenging ideas come. It's not necessarily that you have to accept or agree with them, but can you allow that space for those ideas to exist? It's literally taking that deep breath, going, okay, I hear what you're saying. I don't necessarily agree, but I want to hear more. I want to hear more. I want to hear more. And allowing that space to happen. The second thing comes from genuinely caring about your team members. And this allows for that first level stage of psychological safety, of inclusion. Because when we recognize and appreciate people for their whole selves, not just the work that they produce, not just the outcomes, but then really truly understanding them, that's when they really start feeling accepted and included and belonging on that. And so one of the things I encourage you to do is to measure this. There are various tools out there that can measure psychological safety at the individual level and also at the team level. And these are questions, for example, do we feel like we are listened to? Do we feel like we understand and can see that that things are happening. So, for example, some of the questions is, to what extent do you agree with that I can bring my whole self to work, that I'm empowered to make decisions that impact my work? Teams might be asked, during team meetings, are all members encouraged to speak up and share thoughts? I feel comfortable speaking about problems and issues in the workplace with my immediate manager. These are all questions that you can put into a pulse survey with people that they can respond to, again, anonymously, so that you can understand what's the state of psychological safety, actually measure it. And this is something that Google does on a regular basis. Many other companies also do this as part of their employee engagement surveys. But also, I would encourage you to do this at a team level on a regular basis, potentially quarterly. Have it reported back into a discussion that you actively have, and then hopefully have some actions that you can identify and take around this. The third thing is to set clear expectations and goals. The reason why this is so important is you want to be clear when it's the time and place for new ideas to come in, that you welcome new brainstorming ideas, or this is a place where, again, you can challenge, or this is a place for learning. But just as importantly, when are those not the time? And there may be, for example, that you've decided what the strategy is. You're going to move forward with that. So unless there are some really, really big questions around things that have changed in the environment, we're going to stick with the strategy. We can't rediscuss and go over the strategy over and over and over again, because we'll never be able to lock it in place. So what would be acceptable? What kind of ideas? What gotchas can you see out in the environment? Should you feel comfortable raising? And so it's a fine line to cross and to define what kind of ideas do we want to have surfaced, when, in what circumstances, and when do we feel like those ideas just can't be raised anymore because we already talked about them. It's that time has come and gone. So this is a really important thing, because oftentimes we want it to be, we paint it as if any idea can be surfaced at any time. And the reality is there's a time and place for ideas to come forward, especially encouraged to come forward. And there may be times when, we already discussed this. We can't open this up again. It's time to move forward. And to be really clear about that so the expectations set forward. The fourth thing would be to have multiple ways to surface the ideas. This is, again, we can have anonymous places that people can submit ideas, feedback. It could just even by email, collaboration tools, using Slack, Teams, in-person meetings, one-on-one. But I think a really good thing to do is to carve out specific time in your meetings to share examples of when you've actually taken risks. So one norm that one team did was to, and this is something from Google, is that one of the new norms they had is to kick off every team meeting by sharing a risk that people had taken the previous week. And one of the things they saw is that when they did this, it improved the psychological safety levels by 6%, and also increased the structure and clarity ratings by 10%, because it became very clear on a regular basis what was moving forward, what was not, and people got a much better idea because of the discussions around the risks that people were taking, about what was a good risk, what wasn't a bad risk, and how were those risks actually dealt with. So the key thing here, when you're encouraging people to have multiple ways to share, is that you're encouraging people to share, and then after they share, you're appreciating that they shared. You may not agree with them, but you're appreciating and valuing the fact that they came forward, felt safe enough to be vulnerable, to put themselves out there, and thanking them, because that's a huge reinforcement of the sharing of this psychological safety. Yes, you shared. Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing. Just the act of sharing. Thank you for showing up and speaking up. But thanking people, appreciating them for this, having gratitude for that is super important. And it means, again, that we suspend judgment on the actual idea. We're appreciating the fact that the idea even came forward. And we're giving, again, and reinforcing that there was this allowance, this space for ideas, for psychological safety to be there. The fifth thing, and this is the hard thing, is that we promote discussion and actually foster and encourage disagreement. This is something that oftentimes is not included in psychological safety discussions because it's usually just the initial idea coming up, but then what do you do with that idea? And this is especially hard if you as a leader just fundamentally don't agree with this, to allow some discussion around it and to allow for disagreement. One of the most challenging things to do as a team is to disagree. How do we agree to disagree? And at some point, you as a leader may have to say, okay, I've heard all the arguments one way or the other, and I think we should go this way. And to pull in the people who did not, quote, win the argument and say, it's okay. We're going to ask you to commit now. I've done quite a few other live streams and columns about this whole idea of disagree and commit. It's one of the best principles I see out there, oftentimes championed and attributed to Amazon, but so many other companies do this too as well. And I think, again, that whole idea that we can come together, disagree, really challenge each other, and then in the end, when a decision is made, be 100% committed to an idea, even if it wasn't ours, even if we fundamentally disagree with it. That level of psychological safety, of well-being inside an organization, I think is the highest level of team performance that you can get. So that's what I have for now, for today. I know I've gone over a little bit, but I want to go and see, make sure, and see if there are any other comments here. So let's see, here's a great comment. It's a long one from Christopher. Again, Christopher, thank you so much for being here. It's great to have a Google representative here. Google's research on this, of the 5 key dynamics, researchers identified that psychological safety was by far the most important. And so he has a full link to that one. Again, I have a shorter one here, which I'll put up here again, that you can get to it. But if you're on the, I think he's on LinkedIn, you'll see the comments there too as well, the direct link to that. So thank you so much for sharing that, Christopher. Really appreciate this. Again, I think Google has a lot of issues around just overall culture and things like that. But I think this study in particular was extremely valuable in understanding, again, just echoes a lot of the work that other people have done around team performance and psychological safety and well-being. So again, I encourage you to take a look at what you can do around psychological safety. And in particular, what are some of the things that you can do as a leader to create psychological safety inside of your team? But also, more importantly, how can you scale it inside of your organization? And the key thing here is to put in the processes, to put in the measurements, to put in the imperatives that teams themselves feel psychologically safe, to be able to talk to other teams about what's going on and to challenge them. So that leads me to my last thing here for today, which is would love you to join me next week on Tuesday, the 27th at 9 o'clock Pacific, 12 o'clock Eastern, and 5 o'clock UK time. And we're going to be talking about how to change culture at very large organizations. I'm particularly interested in companies who have this really established culture that may have been there for decades or even centuries. How do you actually change that culture? I attribute it to actually turning the battleship, turning the aircraft carrier. It seems like it would take a huge amount of effort. And yet I've seen this happen over and over and over again, where there have been some fundamental shifts very, very quickly inside of organizations. So we'll take a deep dive into what is it that these organizations did to change their culture relatively on a dime. They were able to spin it around and really change that culture. So join me next week. And in the meantime, I wish you all the best in creating psychological safety for yourself, for your team, and for your organization. Talk to you next week.